Thank you very much, everybody who's been involved in this event. Of course, I particularly thank Dr. Walter Neusel for having had the idea, but not only for having had the idea and making the personal commitment to make it a reality, but also for standing firm in the face of an immense amount of opposition that he has had building up over this entire period. And I thank also all of those who you have heard already from tonight, who have also stood firm despite that opposition. And indeed, we can see from the program list that not everybody did so. And just as in Henry IV, Shakespeare's play Henry IV, he says, when one of his soldiers says, "Oh, I wish we had more of those men in England here to fight with us," and Henry says, "There would be less honour for all of us if they were here." And indeed, of course, the English at Agincourt did win a famous victory. So here too, I think, the fact that there are some gaps in the lineup actually reflects the greater honour on those who did resist the pressure and are still here today. And I thank them very much for having done so. This honour is being given to me, as you have already heard, 40 years after the publication of Animal Liberation. And people often ask me, they have asked me over the years, whether I am pleased with the way the book has been received and has had an effect, an impact. And my answer is that, of course, I am pleased that the book did not simply sink without a trace, as so many good books have sunk without a trace over the years. I am pleased that for 40 years the book has remained in print, at least in English, consistently throughout that period. I'm pleased that it has been translated into more than 20 languages. I'm pleased that just a month or so ago it became available for the first time as an e-book, so that it can be now downloaded by people wherever they are. And I'm particularly pleased when I hear people say, as we have heard tonight from our previous speakers, that the book has had an impact on them and their lives and has led them to do more for animals, to think differently about animals. And I know that there are many others who perhaps have not been able to have quite the same impact as some of our speakers tonight, but who have changed their lives, become vegetarian or vegan, become more active in the animal movement. So I'm delighted by all of that. I am also pleased that the animal movement has made considerable progress over those 40 years. And by the fact that the book may have played some small part in that progress. So, as signs of that progress, let me, for example, say that 40 years ago when the book appeared, when my wife and I visited London, we were, just before its appearance anyway, we were living in Oxford. We went to the best vegetarian restaurant in London, one of just a handful of vegetarian restaurants in London, and its name was Cranks. That is, a crank is somebody who is not quite normal in the head, somebody who's a little weird, rather eccentric. And that was a self-mocking title that the restaurant, of course, gave themselves, but it did capture what people thought of vegetarians 40 years ago. They probably had some rather weird ideas of various kinds that had led them to stop eating meat. Whereas now, of course, it's totally normal not only to be a vegetarian, but to be a vegan. A term that 40 years ago, very few people would have understood. If you talked about being a vegan, most people said, "What's that? Are you one of these aliens from the planet Vega or something like that?" So these are all very welcome changes. And so too are some of the changes in law, which we have seen here in the European Union, for example, changes that Maneka Gandhi has talked about in India, changes even in the United States, more difficult place to bring about change through political action. I think because of the corrupting influence that money has in politics. Money has an influence in politics everywhere, more so I think in the United States. But even there, as of the beginning of this year, California, for example, the law changed because of a referendum that had been held 7 years earlier, so that many of the ways of keeping animals in confinement in factory farms, the worst forms of confinement, which have also now become illegal in the European Union, have at least become illegal in California, if not across the whole of the United States. So I am happy about this project, this progress, and I am very happy, as I say, if the book has played some part. But of course I cannot be happy with the state of animals in the world today. And so I cannot regard animal liberation as anywhere near a truly successful book or work of philosophy. When I was writing Animal Liberation, I have to say, I felt that I discovered a completely compelling argument about why we should be treating animals in a radically different fashion from the fashion in which they are being treated. And at least in some of the moments when I was writing that, I thought, this argument is so clearly sound that I only have to express it in a clear way, and every reader will be convinced by it and will tell other people, we have to stop eating animals. We have to stop treating them in this way. And a movement will grow and spread. Now we would say would spread virally, but this is pre-internet now. I thought spread like a fire, like a brush fire, so that people would stand up against the animal industry and essentially it would collapse. Well, we all know that that didn't happen. And you may say, it was naive to think it could happen. And as I say, it was only in some moments that I thought that would happen. In other moments, I was aware of how far-reaching this change would have to be. You could compare it in some respects with the movement for the abolition of slavery. And even that took many decades to succeed. You might say it's not completely succeeded yet, but it at least succeeded in England, succeeded in the British colonies, succeeded of course in the French colonies even earlier because of the French Revolution, and eventually did succeed in the United States as well. But our attitudes to animals go even deeper, I think, and more fundamental to our daily life than our attitudes, than the attitudes of the slave owners were to slaves. Because that is something that, not everybody was a slave owner, but practically everybody was eating animals and was relying on their exploitation, and had absorbed the attitudes that we were justified or entitled to do so. So that's, I think, why, in a nutshell, we still have a lot of work to do to change the way in which we think about animals. And this prize with which I've been honoured today is, of course, designed to help us to think about strategies for making that further change and eliminating the suffering of animals. So let me address this issue and ask, what are the strategies that we should be using? Well, as I am a philosopher and an author, you won't be surprised to learn that I think one of the strategies that we should be using is to spread the ideas of an ethical way of living that includes animals within the sphere of beings who merit our moral consideration. And indeed, as Stefan Eck so well put it, who merit equal consideration of their interests, so that the pain of an animal counts just as much as the similar pain of a human being. I do think still, 40 years later, that that is a sound principle. Obviously, it has persuaded many of the people here and many others. So I think we need to continue to develop that idea in various distinct ways. So I welcome the contributions, for example, that Melanie Joy has made in her work on carnism, and various other people who have developed this in their own books and in their own ways to reach wider audiences. I do think that it's important that people have an ethical understanding of why we should be changing our attitudes to animals. So I think spreading that message is really the first strategy that I want to recommend. But there are many more specific things that we ought to do. We do now have a large and active animal movement, and a radical animal movement. So this is another change, welcome change from 40 years ago, when we did have the more traditional anti-cruelty organisations, like the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which Richard Ryder mentioned in his message that was read out to you, and which he did a great deal to reform, because 40 years ago it really was focused on dogs and cats and horses, and said nothing about animals being raised for food or animals used in research. Now it does address those issues. But we have a much broader, more active movement, and the question is, what can we say about the strategies that this movement should employ in order to bring about the greatest possible reduction of the suffering of animals? So, the first thing that I would say to that is I do think that it's important to focus on two different things. One is to focus on where the greatest amount of suffering is, and secondly, to focus on where we can succeed in making changes. So you've already heard from speakers today where the greatest amount of suffering is. In terms of sheer numbers, the numbers of animals used for food dwarfs the other areas of animal suffering. We're quoting slightly different figures, I think, but my understanding is roughly 60 billion animals being reared and killed for food each year. The great majority of them living in intensive farms, in factory farms, where their lives are essentially miserable, because the whole premise of the operation is not to give the animals good lives or natural lives or lives for which their instinct is suited. The premise of the operation is to produce the animal product as cheaply as possible so as to compete with competitors who are doing the same thing. And so, subject to the law of the land, which is, as I said, something that can be changed, subject to the law of the land, the animals will always be pushed as hard as they can in terms of the conditions that they are under. So I think we ought to be focusing on this area in order to change it, and not only because of its numbers, but also because I think that the consumption of animals underpins the attitude that animals are things for us to use and that they don't really matter. And I think it's a lot easier for people who are not eating animals to be open-minded about how we ought to treat animals in laboratories, in zoos, in the wild, in a whole range of other ways. So I think this is something that we ought to focus on. Now, there are different ways in which we can do this, and sometimes a divide appears in the animal movement as if somehow only one way can be the right way. I often get asked, for example, I was asked this just a day or two ago, on Sunday in fact, in Greece at a meeting of animal people there. Do I support the idea of animal welfare organisations, or do I support the idea of animal rights organisations? I think that this is a false dichotomy. I think that we ought to support efforts both to improve the welfare of animals in moderate ways, of the sort that has happened here in the European Union, for example, under the laws that changed the keeping of hens, laying hens, the keeping of breeding sows, and the keeping of veal calves. And we ought to support more radical attempts to persuade people not to consume animals at all, to become vegetarian and vegan. And I think that we should not waste energy in trying to say one of these is the right way and the other is not. I think we should accept that we are all part of a broad movement. And one of the reasons that I think this is true, well, I guess there's two reasons. One is, I don't think that we are going to have a vegan world within the present decade. I think it's going to take a long time. I do believe that it's quite possible that we will end up with a vegan world. But that might take 50 years. Maybe it will take less, I hope it will take less, but I certainly would not be bold enough to predict that it would take less. Given that, and given the amount of suffering that exists in factory farms, I don't think the animals can wait that length of time. I think we ought to think of the animals here and now and try to improve their conditions where we can do that through political means, through winnable advances of the kind that you have had here in Europe. And although some people say there's a kind of a contradiction because you make it more acceptable to eat meat, I don't think that that is true. I don't think that is true empirically. I don't see that in countries that have better standards of animal welfare, there are fewer vegans. On the contrary, I think that in precisely those countries where there are better standards of animal welfare, there are actually more vegans because there is more awareness of the issues of how animals are treated. And furthermore, we have to remember that consumers face choices, and one of the factors in their choices is always going to be economic. So if we are trying to promote plant-based alternatives, or even the in vitro meat type of alternatives that Maneka Gandhi mentioned, there is going to be an economic factor in that comparison. When we prevent animal producers from using the methods that they would use if they had a completely open choice, that is, using the methods to produce as cheaply as possible, when we prevent them doing that by having a requirement for larger cages for hens, for not allowing them to keep sows in individual stalls, and so on, obviously we are driving up the price of their product. Otherwise they would be doing these things already. So if we can make it more difficult for them to produce meat cheaply, produce eggs or dairy products cheaply, we will also be making it easier for the products that don't come from a living, sentient, suffering animal to be more competitive. And that's why I think the strategies should embrace animal welfare and should embrace animal rights and should embrace trying to promote vegetarian and vegan diets as well. Now, another question that then arises is, how do we best do this? And it's not always easy to say. As far as the political action is concerned, in fact, I'm not going to attempt to say it, because politics is different in every country, and you have to reach your own decisions in your own particular situations. I'll just mention one example of this. I think that there are some movements now to form parties specifically for animals, as indeed Stefan Eck talked about, and part of his background, if not his present situation, as I understand it. So if you are in a political system that has proportional representation and has a low barrier for entry to Parliament, then I think that's an excellent idea. And we've seen that succeed in the Netherlands, for example, where there is that situation. But in some other situations, it can be a negative. We saw in the United States in the year 2000 that the minority candidature of Ralph Nader for the Greens was sufficient to swing the state of Florida to George W. Bush rather than to Al Gore, because there was no preferential or proportionate voting. Nader took 80,000 votes, most of which we can presume would have gone to Gore, which would have been easily enough to win him the state of Florida and therefore to make him president. We are still suffering the consequences of the fact that George W. Bush, rather than Al Gore, was elected president of the United States. So those kinds of political strategies will depend on particular political systems. But what about attempts to persuade people to move to a diet free of animal products? There, I think we can develop some empirical knowledge on what works. In the book that was mentioned, my most recent book, The Most Good You Can Do, I talk about the growing body of research on effective altruism. What is the most effective thing to do? Where do you get the best value for your dollar or your euro by donating to which charities? In the area of helping people in extreme poverty in developing countries, there is now quite an extensive body of research that you can find online about which charities give you the best value for your dollar. That is just beginning in the animal area. There is a website called Animal Charity Evaluators that is trying to do this for animal charities. It's mostly focused in the United States. It currently recommends just 3 organizations, 2 of which are American, one of which has European presence. I think it would be the first to admit, and I should say I'm a member of the advisory board of this organization, it would be the first to admit that its research is in its infancy. It doesn't yet have the resources to do a great deal of work on this issue. So I think we need more research to show what works. The kind of research that we have, though, is showing that we can persuade people to move towards a vegan diet on the basis either of handing them information, leaflets for example, particularly people at universities, because they tend to be at an age where they're ready to make that change, and also through online advertising that people can click on. The click can lead them to a video, they can learn about factory farming, they can learn about vegan diets. This seems to be a very cost-effective method of helping to persuade people to become vegan. So I hope that the animal movement will also develop this more empirical mindset of looking towards what is really going to work. And let me say, we can't do this with all kinds of action. You can't, you can do studies, you can hand out leaflets and try and follow up people who've got leaflets and see whether they've changed their diet or not. So you can get evidence that way. You can't do similar sorts of studies about political action, for example. Of its nature, it's more, each set of circumstances is unique. But we can still learn what will work. So let me just say a little bit about that before I draw my remarks to a close. When it comes to strategies for action, I'm reminded of my late good friend and colleague, Henry Spiro. Melanie mentioned the book that I wrote about Henry Spiro. It's called Ethics into Action. It has been translated into German, though I'm actually not quite sure whether it's still in print. Henry Spiro, I think, was the most innovative tactician or strategist of the last quarter of the 20th century, at least in the United States. I met Henry back even before Animal Liberation was actually published in New York in 1974, when I was teaching at New York University, and I had the draft chapters of Animal Liberation, and I wanted to try them out, not on an audience of philosophers, because it wasn't a book I was writing really for other philosophers, but on a more general audience. So I offered a course in what in the United States is called continuing education. Some countries it's called adult education. So it's a course where anybody can enroll, they pay a small fee, and they can come to classes. So I offered a course on animal liberation, in which I was essentially trying out the chapters of the book. About 30 people enrolled for it. One of them stood out from the rest, partly, in fact, because he was male, and the majority of those attending were women. This is not unusual still today in the animal movement, that women tend to be at least more than the majority of numbers. But also because he was rather rough and unpolished in his manner and in his accent. So I got talking to him during classes. I discovered that he had a background having worked in various professions as a merchant seaman. He'd worked on the assembly line, auto assembly line in New Jersey, making automobiles for General Motors. But he'd also had a long career fighting for the oppressed. He'd marched in the South for civil rights in the late 50s and 1960s. He tried to organise a union for merchant seamen, an alternative union to the corrupt union that was in league with the bosses. He'd gone to Cuba after the revolution to see whether the revolution was really helping the poor in Cuba, and had written positively about the Cuban Revolution at a time when that was very unpopular in the United States. So he had a long history of working for the oppressed. And he was coming to see that the animals were actually the most oppressed group of all, the ones with the least method of striking back. And at the end of the series of classes that I'd given, rather unexpectedly, Henry stood up and said, "Well, we've all had a lot of interesting theory and philosophy here. Now I think we should do something about it. And if any of you would like to form a group to decide what we ought to do, here's my address. Come to my apartment. I assume you're free at this time of the week, so as you're here at the classes, so a week from now come to my apartment and we'll talk about what to do." And from that group grew what I think was the first successful campaign against a set of animal experiments in the United States. Henry found out the group found out using the Freedom of Information Act about a series of experiments being conducted on cats that, by a remarkable coincidence, was taking place only Henry lived in the American Museum of Natural History. And nobody knew that really in public that the museum was conducting these experiments. So every weekend from then on, a group of people started standing outside the museum to protest the experiments, gradually growing in support until eventually they got Congress people and others to support it and persuaded the funding body, the National Institutes of Health, to cut off the funding for those pointless and cruel experiments. Now, Henry's point of starting with this target was this was an experiment involving cats. Cats are popular animals. This was going on in New York. There's lots of people in New York who can easily get to this target. And this was completely pointless experiments. You only had to describe them. They involved blinding the cats, removing their sense of smell, and then seeing how this affected their mating behaviour. You can imagine, you know, the really important results that would come from that research. So it was a winnable target, and that was how Henry started. But he thought it was important to give the movement some victories, because up to then it had really been banging its head against a brick wall. But he picked a good target and won it, and kept building on from there. And the time came when he saw, after he had that success, he had success with cosmetics testing, with getting big companies like Revlon and Avon to phase out the cosmetics testing on animals. And then he realised that there was more suffering in the farming of animals than in research, and moved on to that area. But always Henry set out with the idea that you want to set your targets so that they're winnable, so that you at least have a chance of winning. He didn't win every campaign, of course, but he did make a lot of successes. And another thing Henry said was, if you can move a big company a small amount, you may do more good than if you can move a very small company maybe all the way. So he started a campaign against McDonald's, because he thought if you can make a bit of a difference with McDonald's, they use so many animals, you'll make a large difference. And McDonald's has shifted, not shifted enough, of course. We would rather have a world in which McDonald's was only serving veggie burgers and other alternatives. But it has shifted in setting standards for the handling and slaughter of the animals that it treats, that it uses. And actually just this week, in the last couple of days, if you followed the news in the United States, you will have seen that Walmart's, who are the biggest seller of meat in the United States, this vast supermarket chain that has always actually been very down market, very focused on having the cheapest products, has now said that it is going to set standards for its producers of animal products. And although, again, those standards are not nearly good enough, this is going to transform the animal industry in a way that a smaller producer could not have done. So there's a whole variety of strategies, as I've been saying, therefore. There's strategies about political action for legislation, which is really important. There's strategies about moving individuals to boycott animal products, moving them away from animal products, thereby weakening the power of the animal industry. And there's strategies for moving corporations with a commercial interest in using animals to make incremental steps to improve the standards, well-being of animals there. All of these strategies, and others that I've not had time to mention, education obviously in the schools, for instance, is another obvious example that we should work on. All of these strategies, I think, have to be pursued by whoever has the greatest talent in these particular areas. So that's what I think we should be doing. I'll simply say a little word about this prize that, as you've seen, I've been awarded. I am very grateful to Dr. Neusel for the prize, but I want to use and I will treasure the medal that he has given me, of course, as a personal award. Will have an honoured place in my room. But this I want to use for the well-being of animals. I will donate, I will divide it between the top-rated charities in the United States that are working for animals according to animal charity evaluators. And I said in the United States because I pay my taxes in the United States, so I can draw a tax deduction, I can make the money go further by donating it there. And I will also donate it to animal charity evaluators themselves, because I do think this effort for extending our knowledge of what is working and what is not working is a fitting place for a prize that is devoted to strategies for the reduction of animal suffering. Thank you very much.